Welcome to Bedtime Express, your sanctuary for slow, immersive storytelling designed to guide you gently into a peaceful sleep. I'm your host, and I'm delighted to have you with us this evening. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey through one of history's most pivotal moments. But before you fall asleep, please help us grow by liking this video, leaving a thoughtful comment below, and subscribing to Bedtime Express for more long-form historical narratives and relaxing stories. Your support helps us create more of the content you love. Tonight, we'll be exploring the Sieges of Vienna in 1529 and 1683, two monumental encounters that shaped the destiny of empires and civilizations. Through rich historical detail and dreamy narration, we'll transport you across centuries to witness moments of courage, strategy, and extraordinary human drama. As you settle in, I encourage you to make yourself comfortable. Adjust your pillows, dim your lights, and prepare your mind to drift away with us. This story is crafted specifically to help you relax and ease into the most restful sleep possible. Now, take a deep breath, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin our descent into the history of Vienna. May you find peace, comfort, and the deepest of sleep. The Siege of Vienna, Ottoman Empire's furthest reach. The story we're about to journey through together begins long before the armies arrived at Vienna's gates. It begins in a time when the world was divided not by imaginary lines on maps, but by the clash of great empires, each believing itself destined to reshape civilization itself. As we settle in for this long evening of history and reflection, let your mind wander back through the centuries to a world both distant and intimately connected to our own. Imagine, if you will, the continent of Europe in the 16th century. It was a time of extraordinary transformation, when the old certainties of medieval Christendom were crumbling like ancient stone, and new powers were rising from the dust. The Renaissance was flowering in Italy, spreading its humanistic light across the continent. The Reformation had shattered the unity of Western Christianity, turning kingdoms against kingdoms in religious fervor. And in the East, a new and terrible power was ascending, one that would test the very limits of European Christendom and force the continent to confront its greatest fear. The Holy Roman Empire, that vast and sprawling confederation of German princes, Bohemians, and Austrians, was governed by the House of Habsburg. The Habsburgs had ruled for generations, their domains spreading across Central Europe like a vast spider's web, encompassing peoples of many languages and faiths. But their power was not absolute, and their unity was perpetually threatened by the ambitions of their constituent states and the religious divisions that tore at the fabric of their realm. They ruled not through iron will alone, but through careful diplomacy, through marriage alliances that connected them to kingdoms across Europe, and through a deep and abiding commitment to their role as defenders of Catholic Christianity. Vienna itself, at the heart of this empire, was a city caught between worlds. It sat on the Danube, that great river that flows from the heart of Germany toward the distant Black Sea, a natural highway for both trade and invasion. The city was surrounded by walls, of course, as all important cities were in those days, but these walls represented far more than mere military fortification. They were the barrier between Christian Europe and the vast Ottoman Empire that pressed against them from the south and east like a dark tide. The people of Vienna knew that they lived in a frontier town, a place where civilization was perpetually defended against the forces that sought to overwhelm it. And what of the Ottoman Empire, this power that would soon come to dominate our story? Picture it now in your mind's eye. A vast dominion stretching from the shores of North Africa across the Middle East and into the Balkans, a realm of extraordinary diversity and sophistication. The Ottomans had inherited the legacy of the Byzantine Empire when they conquered Constantinople in 1453, the great city that had stood for more than 1,000 years as the heart of Orthodox Christianity. They had transformed it into Istanbul, their capital, and had made it the center of a new and formidable empire. The Sultan ruled as both political and religious leader, commanding vast armies and administering a complex bureaucracy that reached across 3 continents. The Ottoman Empire of the 16th century was not the backward, stagnant realm that Western histories would later portray it as. It was a living, breathing civilization of remarkable complexity and achievement. Ottoman architects were building mosques and palaces of stunning beauty. Ottoman scholars were advancing mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Ottoman merchants traded across vast distances, bringing spices from the Orient, silks from Persia, and crafts from across their dominions to markets throughout their realm. And Ottoman soldiers, organized into one of the most professional armies the world had yet seen, stood ready to expand their master's dominions wherever opportunity or strategy demanded it. The army that served the Sultan was unlike anything Europe had yet encountered. The elite units were the Janissaries, soldiers who had been taken as boys from Christian-conquered territories and trained from childhood to be instruments of the Sultan's will. They were not motivated by feudal loyalty to a local lord, as European soldiers often were, but by direct devotion to the Sultan himself. They were professional soldiers in the truest sense, equipped with the latest weapons, trained in complex maneuvers, and organized in a way that European armies, still relying largely on feudal levies and mercenaries, could not match. They inspired both fear and grudging admiration in those who faced them. As we drift deeper into our story, we must ask ourselves, why Vienna? Why did this particular city, at these particular moments in history, become the focus of the Ottoman ambitions? The answer lies in geography and strategy, in the relentless logic of imperial expansion. Vienna was the gateway. Control Vienna, and you could threaten the heart of Central Europe. You could dominate the Danube Valley. You could press forward into territories that had once belonged to the Ottoman Empire's rivals and predecessors. Vienna represented not merely a military objective, but a symbolic threshold across it, and the entire nature of European politics would transform. The early part of the 16th century had been a time of relative peace between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, though it was a peace constantly threatened by smaller conflicts and raids along the frontier. But as the century progressed, the pressure mounted. Ottoman power was at its height under the greatest of the sultans, Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. He was called Kanuni, the lawgiver, by his own people, a man who saw himself as continuing the great tradition of Islamic empire that stretched back through the ages. Under his rule, the Ottoman Empire reached its maximum territorial extent, and his ambitions seemed boundless. It was in the mind of Suleiman and his viziers that a great plan took shape. Why should the Ottoman realm be confined to the eastern and southern portions of Europe? Why should they not continue their expansion northward and westward, bringing their dominion to encompass more of the continent? Why should Vienna not become an Ottoman city, its churches converted to mosques, its people converted to Islam, its role transformed from a Christian fortress into a jewel in the Ottoman crown? This was not mere fantasy or passing ambition. This was the thoughtful strategy of the most powerful rulers of the age, convinced that they possessed the military means to achieve their goals. As we prepare to move forward into the first siege, let us pause and meditate on what we are about to witness. We are about to see two great civilizations, two different visions of what Europe could become, collide at a single point. We are about to witness courage and fear, strategy and chance, the grand clash of armies and the private moments of individuals faced with extraordinary circumstances. The people who lived through these events did not know which way history would turn. They did not know whether Vienna would fall or stand, whether the Ottoman tide would sweep across Europe, or whether it would be turned back. They lived with that uncertainty as a constant companion, and in that uncertainty lies much of the drama of their story. The year was 1529, and the word spread through Vienna like a plague. The Sultan was coming. Not just armies, but the Sultan himself, Suleiman the Magnificent, had resolved to personally lead the campaign against the Christian city. This was unprecedented, For a sultan to travel so far from his capital, to place himself in the field of battle so far from his base of power, it meant that Suleiman took this campaign with the utmost seriousness, that he believed the prize was worth the risk, that he intended not merely a raid or a limited military action, but a decisive blow against the Habsburg Empire. The preparations for this campaign had been extraordinarily lengthy and complex. The Ottoman army could not simply march from Istanbul to Vienna as a modern army might move along a highway. The distances were vast, nearly 2,000 kilometers, or about 1,100 miles, and the route led through difficult terrain and territory that was sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile. The army had to be provisioned from its base. Supplies had to be transported along lengthy supply lines. Fortifications had to be established at strategic points. The logistics of moving such a vast force across such distances were staggering to contemplate. Yet the Ottomans managed it with a degree of efficiency that spoke volumes about their administrative capabilities. The question in the minds of the Viennese was simple: could the city be defended? Vienna's walls, though substantial, were not of the modern trace bastions that would later prove so effective against cannon fire. They were older medieval walls, designed for an earlier age of warfare. And the garrison was pitifully small, perhaps 10,000 soldiers in total, many of them poorly trained, some of them mere volunteers from among the city's population. News of the approaching Ottoman army sent waves of panic through the city's streets. Merchants began moving their goods to safety. Wealthy families packed their possessions and fled westward toward the relative safety of the German lands. The emperor himself, King Ferdinand of Austria, was not in the city but watching from a distance, coordinating such relief efforts as he could muster. The defensive preparations that were undertaken in Vienna during the spring of 1529 were desperate and determined. Nicholas, the Count of Salm, was appointed as the military commander of Vienna's defense, and he threw himself into the work with the focused intensity of a man who knows that failure means death. The walls were strengthened as much as the available time and resources would allow. Some gates were sealed shut entirely, creating a smaller perimeter that could be more easily defended. Supplies of food, water, and ammunition were gathered from across the Habsburgs' territories and stockpiled within the city. Wells were dug to ensure an adequate water supply, even if the city was cut off from the outside world. Every available space was used to prepare defenses or store supplies. The population of Vienna during this time lived in an almost unbearable state of suspense. Rumors circulated constantly about the size of the approaching Ottoman army. Estimates grew wilder and more terrifying with each retelling. Some said there were 100,000 soldiers marching toward them. Others said 200,000. In reality, the Ottoman force was probably between 80 and 150,000 strong, though exact numbers are difficult to determine from historical records. But to those living in Vienna, the exact number mattered less than the undeniable fact. They were hopelessly outnumbered, and a vast army was bearing down upon them like a storm from the east. In May of 1529, the Ottoman army began its long march toward Vienna. Suleiman the Magnificent rode at the head of his vast host, surrounded by his elite bodyguards and his court officers. The army stretched for miles behind him, a river of humanity and horses and equipment moving northwestward through territories that grew progressively more Christian and more European as they advanced. Ottoman soldiers burned and destroyed as they went, creating a path of terror before them that made the Christian populations flee in panic, creating refugees that further clogged the roads and increased the sense of catastrophe. The summer of 1529 was a season of waiting and dread for Vienna. As July turned to August, the knowledge that the Sultan's army was drawing closer became an almost physical presence in the city. Scouts brought reports of the army's position, of villages burned, of fortifications taken. The emperor, from his position to the west, sent what reinforcements he could, but the numbers remained desperately inadequate. The citizens of Vienna faced the prospect of a siege with the grim understanding that no relief was likely to reach them, that if the city fell, they would be on their own, and that the fate of those captured in a siege could be terrible indeed. The Ottoman army finally arrived at Vienna on September 27th, 1529. The first soldiers to appear before the city's walls were not the main army, but scouts and advance cavalry, probing the defenses, looking for weaknesses. Within hours, the entire army was encamped around the city, and Vienna was surrounded. From the walls, the defenders could see the vast Ottoman camps stretching across the countryside, tent cities that housed an army larger than the population of Vienna itself. The Ottomans had siege equipment with them cannons, which were still relatively new and terrifying weapons, though not yet perfected into the instruments of destruction they would later become: mortars, sappers' tools, and all the apparatus of a properly equipped siege warfare operation. Suleiman's first move was to offer Vienna an opportunity to surrender. An emissary was sent to the walls bearing a message: lay down arms, open the gates, convert to Islam, and acknowledge the Sultan's sovereignty, and the city could be spared. This was not mere cruelty, though the Ottomans could be cruel. It was also practical. A city that surrendered peacefully could then be incorporated into the Ottoman realm as a productive territory, whereas a city that was stormed would be destroyed in the process and its population killed or enslaved. But Count Salm and his defenders refused. The answer came back from the walls. Vienna would not surrender, would not convert, and would not bow to the Sultan. Vienna would defend itself to the last man. And so the siege began in earnest. The Ottoman artillery began its bombardment of Vienna's walls. The cannons roared day after day, their shots striking the ancient medieval walls with terrible force. Sections of the wall crumbled and fell. Dust rose from the impacts, creating clouds that obscured the city itself. The defenders worked frantically to repair the damage, moving rubble, reinforcing weakened sections, filling gaps with whatever materials they could find. It was backbreaking, exhausting work, and it went on for weeks. But as the autumn advanced, the Ottoman assault began to encounter serious obstacles beyond the mere physical difficulty of breaking through Vienna's defenses. The autumn rains came early that year, turning the ground around Vienna into mud. The Ottoman supply lines, already stretched over enormous distances, became even more precarious as roads became impassable. Supplies that had left Istanbul weeks or months earlier were now failing to arrive with regularity. The Ottoman soldiers, far from their homes in a foreign land, in an increasingly cold and hostile climate, began to suffer from disease and cold. Morale, which had been high at the beginning of the campaign, began to deteriorate as the weeks dragged on without any sign of the walls breaking. Count Sam, for his part, proved to be a brilliant defensive commander. He understood that his role was not to defeat the Ottomans in open battle that would have been suicide given the vast disparity in numbers, but rather to hold out long enough that circumstances would force the Ottomans to abandon the siege. He carefully managed the city's supplies, ensuring that the population did not starve even as rations grew smaller. He rotated defenders to give them periods of rest, maintaining morale and effectiveness despite the constant bombardment and occasional assaults on the walls. He encouraged the citizens to see themselves as participants in a great struggle for Christendom, helping to transform the siege from a nightmare of despair into a heroic test that could be endured. The fighting during the siege was often hand-to-hand and desperate. Ottoman sappers, soldiers whose role was to dig beneath the walls and undermine them, created tunnels beneath Vienna's defenses. Habsburg soldiers, having discovered these tunnels, would push into them and fight in the darkness, sometimes hand to hand, fighting over tunnels barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. These tunnel fights were among the most vicious of the siege, for they offered no room for tactics or large-scale maneuvers, only brutal, close combat in conditions of nearly complete darkness. Men died in those tunnels, crushed or stabbed by enemies they could barely see, and their bodies often remained there, adding to the horror and the stench of the underground warfare. As October arrived and autumn deepened, the situation became increasingly clear to Suleiman and his commanders. Vienna was not going to fall. The walls were damaged but not breached, and the defenders showed no sign of yielding despite the overwhelming odds against them. The Ottoman army was suffering from exposure to the elements and from the stretched supply lines. Disease was beginning to take a toll on the troops, and there was another, perhaps even more pressing concern. The emperor's forces, though small, were not entirely absent, and there were rumors of relief armies being gathered, of reinforcements that might arrive to attempt to break the siege. If Vienna was relieved while the Ottoman army sat starving and cold outside its walls, the entire campaign could turn into a disaster, with the Sultan's forces defeated and forced to retreat in humiliation. On October 15th, 1529, Suleiman gave the order that changed everything. The siege of Vienna was to be lifted. The order was received with a mixture of relief and bitter disappointment by the Ottoman soldiers, who had suffered greatly and now would retreat without victory. But Suleiman, for all his greatness, understood the logic of when to advance and when to withdraw, and he understood that a siege that could not be won quickly would become a disaster if prolonged indefinitely. The Ottoman army, after 2 months of siege, began its retreat from Vienna. The lifting of the siege was perhaps as traumatic an event for Vienna as the siege itself had been, but in a different way. The citizens emerged from their homes, expecting disaster, and instead found that their city still stood, that the army that had seemed so invincible had withdrawn, that they had survived. The relief was almost overwhelming, and it was accompanied by a surge of pride and even a kind of triumphalism. Vienna had defeated the mighty Sultan. Vienna had defended Christendom. The city that had been on the brink of annihilation found itself transformed into a symbol of Christian resistance, a beacon of hope to troubled kingdoms throughout Europe. Count Salm was hailed as a hero, and his name became synonymous with the defense of Vienna and of Christian Europe against the Ottoman threat. He had performed a seemingly impossible task, held a city with meager resources against an overwhelming force, inflicted enough casualties and resistance that the Sultan himself decided to abandon the campaign. The Ottoman army that retreated from Vienna in October 1529 was not defeated in the conventional sense, but it was denied victory, and in the calculus of strategy and prestige, that denial of victory was a kind of defeat. The consequences of the siege of 1529 rippled across Europe and beyond. For the Habsburgs, it confirmed Vienna's role as the bastion of Catholic Europe, the city that stood against Islam and the Ottoman expansion. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a sobering reminder that expansion into Europe would not be as simple as conquering the Balkans had been, that the Christian kingdoms were capable of defending themselves, and that the northern frontier of Ottoman power was not an inevitably moving line that would sweep the Christians before it. The siege of 1529 created a kind of stalemate that would persist for more than a century. The Ottomans would continue to be a threat to Central Europe, but Vienna would remain out of their grasp, and the frontier would settle into a kind of grinding, long-term conflict. But before we move forward in time to the next siege, let us consider the human experience of those months in 1529. What was it like to be a citizen of Vienna, trapped within walls that might crumble at any moment, facing the possibility of death or slavery or forced conversion to Islam? What was it like to be a Habsburg soldier, defending a city with inadequate resources, knowing that no relief was coming, that the weight of Christendom's survival rested on your shoulders and the shoulders of your comrades? What was it like to be an Ottoman soldier, far from home in a hostile land, suffering from cold and disease and hunger, watching your comrades fall to artillery fire and counterattacks from the walls, slowly realizing that the great victory your sultan had promised was not going to come? These were not just historical events, but human experiences of extraordinary intensity and significance. As we settle back into the comfort of our observation, reflecting on these events across the centuries that separate us from them, we might find ourselves wondering about the nature of history itself. How different would the world be if Vienna had fallen in 1529? What if the Ottoman army had broken through the walls? If the defenders had been overwhelmed? If the city had fallen to Suleiman's forces? Would Europe be a different place today? Would it be more Islamic? Would the Renaissance and Reformation have taken different paths? Would the entire history of the continent have been transformed by this single event? These are the kinds of questions that historians contemplate, the roads not taken, the histories that were possible but did not occur. After 1529, Vienna and the Ottoman Empire entered into a new phase of their relationship, one that would last for more than a century and a half, a phase of persistent tension, limited warfare, occasional truces, and a gradual movement toward another great confrontation. This period was not one of peace, for there was no peace along the frontier between Christian and Ottoman territories, but neither was it one of large-scale warfare or total conflict. Instead, it was an era of what historians sometimes call Cold War in modern terms. Though that terminology can be somewhat misleading, the conflict was real and deadly, but it was also limited and ritualized in ways that the total wars of later centuries would not be. The decades following 1529 saw repeated military campaigns, mostly led by Ottoman forces attempting to push deeper into Central Europe, but none of them achieved the kind of decisive breakthrough that Suleiman had hoped for. Vienna itself remained untouched by major Ottoman attacks, protected not only by its walls and garrison, but by the fact that the Ottoman Empire's attentions were often diverted to other regions of their vast dominions. The Ottoman Empire, for all its power and extent, was far from a unified and harmonious realm. It had enemies in North Africa, threats from Persia to the east, Christian rivals on the Mediterranean, and the constant challenges of administering an enormous empire across vast distances and diverse populations. Suleiman the Magnificent died in 1566, and his death marked something of a watershed in Ottoman history. He was succeeded by his son Selim II, who proved to be less militarily ambitious than his father, though still capable and formidable. The age of Suleiman, which had seen the Ottoman Empire at its maximum territorial expansion and its highest level of military aggressiveness, had passed. The Ottoman Empire would continue to be a great power for centuries to come, but the era of expansion was gradually giving way to an era of consolidation and, eventually, slow decline. The frontier between Habsburg and Ottoman territories during this long century became something of a military frontier, similar in some ways to the frontiers between Rome and the Germanic kingdoms in ancient times, or the border between medieval Christendom and the Islamic Caliphate in earlier centuries. There were fortified positions on both sides, communities that existed in a state of near-constant warfare or threat of warfare, soldiers who made their careers fighting raids and counter-raids, merchants and spies and refugees who moved back and forth across the border carrying news and information. This frontier life developed its own culture and its own peculiar dynamics. Raiders from one side would attack settlements on the other, prompting retaliatory raids, creating cycles of violence that could persist for decades, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. During this period, Vienna itself gradually transformed from a desperate frontier fortress under siege into a center of increasing European importance and power. The Habsburgs moved their capital from Prague to Vienna, making it the seat of their imperial government. The city grew in population and in wealth, despite the ever-present threat from Ottoman raids and attacks. New buildings were constructed, including churches, fortifications, and the palaces of the imperial household. Vienna became not just a military bastion, but also a cultural center, a place where Renaissance and Baroque art and architecture flourished, where scholars and artists gathered, where the wealth of empire was displayed and celebrated. But beneath this surface of civilization and culture, the threat remained ever present. The walls of Vienna were continuously upgraded and improved, incorporating the latest developments in military architecture. The garrison was maintained at a significant strength, with professional soldiers who had trained for years in anticipation of the day when the Ottoman armies might return. The citizens of Vienna lived with the knowledge that at any moment the peace could shatter and the armies could return. This knowledge never fully faded, for the Ottoman Empire remained a formidable power, and the history of the 1529 siege was a constant reminder of the danger that lurked to the east. The wars along the frontier during this period were sometimes called the Long War, or in some historical contexts, the Austro-Turkish Wars. They consisted of countless smaller conflicts, raids, and counter-raids, interspersed with periods of relative calm and even occasional treaties or truces between the great powers. These truces were usually temporary arrangements, often lasting only a few years before hostilities resumed for reasons both trivial and profound. The conflicts were often triggered by disputes over territory, over the tribute that Christian vassals in the Ottoman sphere paid to the Sultan, or simply by the natural friction that occurred when two powerful empires pressed against each other across a long and porous frontier. One of the most significant of these conflicts was the Long War that lasted from 1593 to 1606, one of the longest and most destructive wars of Central Europe in the 16th and early 17th centuries. This war saw repeated Ottoman invasions of Habsburg territories, with campaigns that reached deep into Hungary and Transylvania. The war was enormously destructive, devastating the borderlands and killing or displacing hundreds of thousands of people. Yet, despite the Ottomans' considerable military advantages and the resources they were able to bring to bear, they were never able to break through and capture Vienna again, nor were they able to achieve the kind of decisive victory that would have transformed the political balance of Central Europe. The Long War eventually ended in 1606 with the Treaty of Zitzit-Faterok, which represented a kind of mutual exhaustion rather than a decisive victory for either side. The treaty confirmed the territorial status quo, with Vienna remaining in Habsburg hands and the Ottoman Empire holding its possessions in Hungary and the Balkans. But the treaty also represented something more significant, a recognition that the Ottoman Empire, for all its power, could not necessarily dominate Central Europe in the way that some of its leaders had once hoped. The Habsburgs, by defending Vienna and maintaining their territories through centuries of conflict, had preserved their realm and prevented Ottoman expansion from sweeping them away. As we contemplate this long century of frontier warfare and strategic standoff, we should consider what it meant for the people who lived through it. Soldiers spent entire careers, decades of their lives, fighting in these frontier wars, often in small-scale battles and raids that were never recorded in the great histories that shaped the landscape and the politics of entire regions, but were rarely seen as historically significant. Communities along the frontier lived in constant danger, never knowing whether the next year would bring a major Ottoman offensive or a period of relative peace. Families were uprooted and displaced as empires advanced or retreated. The economy of entire regions was disrupted by the constant warfare. Yet, through all this, the fundamental boundary between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire remained relatively stable, with Vienna at the center of the Christian world, unchanged and unconquered. The 17th century dawned with Vienna still standing, still proud, still the symbol of Christian Europe's resistance to Ottoman power. But the 17th century would also bring new challenges and new opportunities, new political configurations and new military technologies that would reshape the contest between empires. By the middle of the century, new forces were rising in Europe, France was becoming a great power. The Protestant kingdoms of northern Europe were asserting themselves. The age of Spanish dominance was passing. And meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, despite its continued military strength, was beginning to show signs of the internal stress and decay that would eventually lead to its long decline. History was shifting, like a great ship slowly changing course, and Vienna would find itself in a new and different world than the one of the 16th century. But as we prepare to move forward to the second great siege of Vienna, let us pause and reflect on the power of time and change. The world of 1529 was very different from the world of 1683, more than a century and a half later. Technologies had evolved, new weapons had been developed, the political landscape of Europe had been transformed by the Reformation, the rise of new powers, and the decline of others. Yet, the fundamental contest between Vienna and the Ottoman Empire persisted. The fundamental threat remained even as its nature changed. History is not a simple story of steady progress or inevitable decline, but rather a complex weaving of continuity and change, of forces that persist across centuries and transformations that reshape everything. More than a century and a half after Suleiman's armies turned away from Vienna's walls, another Ottoman army would arrive at the same city with a similar purpose to take it if possible, to demonstrate Ottoman power and expand Ottoman territories into the heart of Central Europe. But the world of 1683 was very different from the world of 1529, and the second siege would take place in a fundamentally different context, against a different background of European politics and military capabilities. The Ottoman Empire of the late 17th century was not the same vigorous, expanding power that it had been under Suleiman. By the 1682, the empire was showing unmistakable signs of the stresses and strains that would eventually lead to its long decline across the 18th and 19th centuries. The central administration was less effective. The military was no longer as uniformly excellent as it had been in earlier centuries, and corruption in the imperial bureaucracy was becoming a serious problem. Yet the empire remained formidable, and there were still viziers and commanders who believed that bold action, particularly the conquest of Vienna and the territories of Central Europe, could restore the empire's vigor and expand its dominions. The immediate cause of the second siege lay in Ottoman-Polish conflict. The Ottomans had been waging wars against Poland and against the Cossack Hetmanate in the Ukraine, seeking to extend Ottoman control over that region as well. Muscovy, the rising Russian power to the north, was also a concern for the Ottomans, and controlling the regions of southern Ukraine would allow the Ottomans to better secure their northern frontier against Russian expansion. A new Grand Vizier had come to power in Istanbul, a man named Kara Mustafa Pasha. who believed that the time was right for a grand thrust northward, for a campaign that would seize Vienna and transform the Ottoman position in Central Europe. Kara Mustafa Pasha was a man of considerable ability and ambition, but also of overconfidence and political ambition that sometimes clouded his judgment. He saw in Vienna an opportunity, a chance to make a name for himself that would secure his position at the heart of Ottoman power, a way to restore the prestige of the empire through a great military victory. He convinced the Sultan Mehmed IV and the Imperial Council that a campaign against Vienna was feasible, that the time was right, that the Christians were unprepared, and that Vienna could be taken. In many ways, his arguments were not unreasonable. Vienna had grown complacent, the Habsburgs were focused on other concerns, the city's defenses were no longer as formidable as they had been in the era of Suleiman. Yet Kara Mustafa failed to fully appreciate the changes that had taken place in the intervening century and a half, the way European military power had evolved, and the degree to which the Habsburgs, while not as great a power as they had been, were still capable of mounting effective resistance. The Ottoman campaign of 1683 began with a strategy that differed from Suleiman's campaign of 1529 inches. One crucial respect: this time the Ottomans would not march directly to Vienna. Instead, they would first consolidate their control over Hungary, capturing key strongholds and establishing a secure base of operations from which to approach Vienna. This was both a more cautious strategy than Suleiman's direct march, and a more ambitious one, for it suggested that the Ottomans intended to permanently occupy and hold Hungarian territory, not merely conduct a raid into Christian lands and then retreat. The Ottoman army that assembled in early 1683 was enormous, perhaps the largest Ottoman field army that had been mobilized in decades. Estimates of its size vary from source to source, but contemporary accounts suggest that it numbered somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 soldiers, supported by thousands of camp followers, servants, and supply personnel. This vast army included not only Ottoman regulars, but also contingents from vassal states and tributary territories, Moldavians, Wallachians, Circassians, and others who owed allegiance to the Sultan and were obligated to provide forces for his campaigns. The army also included Crimean Tatars, fierce cavalry fighters from the steppes north of the Black Sea, who were among the most effective light cavalry in the world at that time. In the spring of 1683, this massive Ottoman army began to move northward from its staging areas in the Balkans and eastern Hungary. As it did, it left a wake of destruction and fear throughout the lands it passed through. Christian populations fled before the advancing Ottoman forces, creating refugees that clogged the roads leading westward. Fortified towns and cities were besieged and taken, their garrisons slaughtered or enslaved. The psychological impact of the advancing Ottoman army was enormous. It seemed as if the Ottoman threat that had seemed to be fading over the previous century was suddenly and terrifyingly real again, as if the great showdown that everyone had expected to come had finally arrived. Vienna in 1683 was unprepared for this crisis in the way that Vienna in 1529 had been, at least initially. The city had grown complacent after more than a century of relative security, and while the walls were well maintained and the garrison was reasonably well prepared, there was not the same sense of desperate urgency that had existed in 1529. Moreover, the Emperor Leopold I was not in Vienna when the news of the approaching Ottoman army arrived. Leopold was a cautious ruler, sometimes indecisive, more inclined toward diplomacy and negotiation than toward military confrontation. When he learned of the approaching army, his first instinct was not to remain in Vienna and prepare for a siege, but rather to move west toward Passau and then toward the safety of the German lands, from where he could coordinate efforts to relieve the city if it came to that. The evacuation of Leopold I and his court from Vienna in July 1683 was a humbling moment for the Habsburg dynasty, a public acknowledgement that the emperor himself did not believe the city could be easily defended. The people of Vienna received the news of their emperor's departure with a mixture of fear and bitter disappointment. Leopold's departure seemed to confirm the worst fears. If the emperor himself was fleeing, then surely the city was lost. Surely the Ottoman army was unstoppable. Surely the same fate that had threatened Vienna in 1529 was about to unfold again. Panic seized portions of the population, and people began to flee the city in large numbers, taking whatever valuables they could carry and heading westward after the emperor. Into this situation of fear and uncertainty came a new figure who would become the hero of Vienna's second siege, Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. Starhemberg was a professional soldier, a man in his 60s, who had spent much of his life fighting against the Ottomans on the frontier of the Habsburg lands. He was appointed as the military commander of Vienna's defense, and like Count Salm before him, he threw himself into the work of preparing the city for siege with the focused intensity of a man determined to succeed. But Starhemberg's task was, in some ways, easier than Salm's had been. The defenses of Vienna had been significantly improved since 1529. The walls had been rebuilt with modern trace bastions that were far more effective against cannon fire, and the city had a garrison of perhaps 15,000 soldiers, larger than what Salm had commanded, though still vastly outnumbered by the approaching Ottoman army. Starhemberg's preparations for the siege were thorough and professional. The city was divided into sectors, each with its own commander and its own responsibilities for defense. Supplies were gathered and stockpiled, provisions of food, ammunition, and medical supplies were accumulated throughout the city. The population was organized into work details to further strengthen the defenses, to fill in sections of the city that might become killing zones if the outer defenses were breached, to prepare positions that could be held if the Ottoman forces broke through the main walls. Stalemate also took measures to maintain morale and to organize the city's defenders into a coherent military force rather than a collection of disparate units. He issued orders and regulations for the defense, organized regular inspections of the fortifications, and maintained strict discipline among the troops. The Ottoman army arrived at Vienna on July 14, 1683, after a campaign that had lasted weeks and had covered hundreds of kilometers of territory. Like Suleiman's army in 1529, they found Vienna surrounded by walls and defended by soldiers determined to resist. But there were significant differences from the earlier siege. The Ottoman army in 1683 was somewhat worn down by its long campaign, by the sieges it had already conducted, by the losses it had already suffered. More importantly, the interval since 1529 had allowed military technology to advance significantly. The cannon fire of 1683 was far more effective and devastating than the cannon fire of 1529 had been. The fortifications of Vienna had evolved to take advantage of these technologies, with the trace bastions being specifically designed to be more resistant to cannon fire and to allow defenders to bring effective fire against attacking forces. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier commanding the Ottoman forces, faced a choice that would define the outcome of the entire campaign. He could attempt a quick assault on Vienna's walls, risking heavy casualties in an effort to storm the city before relief forces could arrive. Or he could conduct a more methodical siege, bringing up siege equipment, establishing formal siege lines, and attempting to breach the walls through artillery bombardment and mining operations. Kara Mustafa chose the second option, which seemed more prudent and which was more in line with Ottoman siege warfare doctrine as it had developed over the centuries. This choice, however, would turn out to be fateful, for it gave the Christians time to organize relief forces, and it meant that the Ottoman army would remain static outside Vienna's walls, dependent on supply lines that were already stretched to their limits. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 lasted approximately 2 months, from mid-July until mid-September. Like the Siege of 1529, it was a constant bombardment of the walls, a series of assaults and counter-assaults, a grinding war of attrition as the Ottomans attempted to break through the defenses while the defenders fought to hold them back. The Ottoman artillery was devastating, causing significant damage to the walls and fortifications, and at several points during the siege, it seemed as though the Ottomans might succeed in breaking through. But each time they breached the outer works, they encountered secondary defenses that had been prepared by Stalemate and his engineers, obstacles that slowed their advance and allowed the defenders to concentrate their forces and drive them back. One of the most dramatic moments of the siege came when the Ottomans successfully mined beneath one of the major bastions, causing a section of the fortification to collapse. The breach was significant, and for a few hours it seemed as though the Ottoman forces might pour through and overwhelm the defenders. But Starhemberg, having anticipated the possibility of such a breach, had prepared contingency defenses behind the walls, and the defenders rallied to meet the threat. The fighting that followed was some of the most vicious of the entire siege, with hand-to-hand combat in and around the breached fortification lasting for hours. The Ottomans poured troops through the breach, but the defenders, fighting now from interior positions where they could bring concentrated fire to bear, held fast and eventually pushed the Ottoman forces back. The breach was repaired, and the Ottoman assault was repulsed. As the weeks of siege passed, the situation began to change in ways that worked against the Ottomans. The relief forces that Emperor Leopold had begun to organize were slowly gathering to the north and west of Vienna. The Saxon army under their duke was moving southward to assist Vienna. More importantly, the Polish forces were mobilizing. King John Sobieski of Poland, one of the most capable military commanders of the age, had decided to intervene in the crisis threatening Vienna. The decision to send Polish forces to relieve Vienna was not a foregone conclusion. Poland had its own concerns about Ottoman expansion and had been fighting Ottoman forces in other theaters, but Sobieski recognized that the fall of Vienna would be a catastrophe for Christendom, and he committed Polish cavalry to the relief effort. By mid-September 1683, the relief forces had gathered in sufficient strength that they posed a serious threat to the Ottoman army's siege operations. Kara Mustafa faced a dilemma: continue the siege in hopes of breaking through Vienna's walls before the relief forces could effectively intervene, or lift the siege and consolidate Ottoman gains in Hungary. The decision he made was to make one final, massive assault on Vienna's walls, an all-out effort that would either break through or would signal that Vienna could not be taken. He hoped that a crushing assault might break the defenders' will to resist and force Vienna to surrender, even as the relief forces were gathering outside the city. On September 11th, 1683, the Ottoman forces launched their final assault on Vienna's walls. It was a massive attack, involving tens of thousands of soldiers, with waves of attackers throwing themselves against the fortifications in an effort to break through. The defenders, now aware that relief was nearby, fought with renewed vigor and desperate determination. They knew that if they could hold for just a few more hours, the relief forces would arrive and the siege would be broken. The fighting was intense and brutal, with the outcome in doubt for much of the day. At several points, it seemed as though the Ottomans might break through, but the defenders held firm and repulsed each assault. As the sun began to set on September 11th, 1683, the situation on the battlefield began to change dramatically. On the heights overlooking Vienna, riders on horseback appeared, and they were not Ottoman cavalry. They were the vanguard of the relief forces, Polish cavalry, under the command of King John Sobieski, arriving at the crucial moment. The sight of these fresh forces appearing on the battlefield was enough to break the Ottoman assault. Kara Mustafa, realizing that his assault had failed and that the arrival of the relief forces had transformed the strategic situation, gave the order for the Ottoman forces to break off their assault and prepare to retreat. What followed was one of the most celebrated cavalry charges in history. King John Sobieski, commanding the combined Polish and German cavalry, launched a massive charge down the slopes overlooking Vienna's positions against the Ottoman forces. The Ottoman army, still in the midst of their retreat and not prepared to face a massed cavalry charge, broke apart in chaos and confusion. The cavalry charge smashed through the Ottoman positions, scattering their forces and sending them into headlong retreat. Panic spread through the Ottoman camps, and in the chaos of the retreat, Kara Mustafa Pasha abandoned his personal baggage and treasures in his camp and fled northwestward toward Hungary with whatever forces he could rally. The retreat of the Ottoman army from Vienna was not an organized tactical withdrawal, but a full-scale rout, one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in the history of the Ottoman Empire. The Christian relief forces pursued the fleeing Ottomans, harassing them and inflicting additional casualties as they retreated. The Ottoman army that had seemed so invincible just days earlier was now in complete disarray, its soldiers exhausted, demoralized, and desperate to escape the pursuing Christians. The Ottoman siege equipment was abandoned, their camps left behind with all of their supplies and treasures, their wounded left to be captured or mercy killed by the pursuing cavalry. Vienna, which had been on the brink of being overrun just hours earlier, found itself suddenly relieved. The Ottoman army was in full retreat, the siege had been broken, and the city was saved. The relief forces poured through Vienna's gates to rest and replenish themselves, and the people of Vienna emerged from their shelters and fortifications to witness the incredible transformation in their fortunes. The despair and fear that had gripped the city just hours earlier gave way to joy and gratitude, mixed with wonder at how close they had come to disaster and how narrowly they had escaped it. The consequences of the failure of the second siege were even more significant than the consequences of the first siege's failure had been. For the Ottoman Empire, the failure of such a massive and expensive military campaign, the loss of enormous quantities of equipment and supplies, and the psychological impact of defeat at the gates of Vienna represented a turning point in Ottoman history. The aura of Ottoman invincibility, already tarnished by a century and a half of frontier warfare, was shattered. The Ottoman Empire would continue to be a major power for another 2 centuries, but the assumption that it would inevitably expand its territories at the expense of Europe had been decisively disproven. For the Christian powers of Europe, and particularly for the Habsburg Empire, the relief of Vienna represented a vindication and a confirmation of their role as defenders of Christian Europe. More than that, it represented an opportunity. The Ottoman retreat from Vienna opened the possibility of a counter-offensive, an attempt to push back Ottoman power in the Balkans and Hungary, to recover territories that had been lost to the Ottomans in earlier centuries. In the decades following the relief of Vienna, a series of wars between the Ottomans and Christian powers would see Ottoman territory in Europe steadily contract, with the Habsburgs gradually expanding their control over Hungary and other regions at Ottoman expense. The figure of King John Sobieski, who had arrived at the crucial moment to break the Ottoman siege, became a legendary hero in European imagination. His cavalry charge at Vienna became one of the great symbolic events of European history, a moment that seemed to represent the triumph of Christian Europe over the Muslim threat, the victory of Western civilization over Oriental despotism, the turning of the tide that would eventually push the Ottoman Empire out of Europe almost entirely. Sobieski became celebrated in the courts of Europe, honored by the Pope, and remembered in Polish history as one of the greatest of Polish kings and military commanders. As we prepare to bring our long journey through these 2 great sieges to a close, let us pause and reflect on what we have witnessed and what these events mean for us across the centuries that separate us from them. The sieges of Vienna in 1529 and 1683 were not merely military events, important though they were in military history. They were moments of fundamental significance in the history of Europe, instances when the outcome of events hung in delicate balance, when different choices or slightly different circumstances could have led to dramatically different consequences for the future. When we think about the siege of 1529 and how Vienna might have fallen to Suleiman the Magnificent, we enter the realm of historical speculation, but it is speculation grounded in the realities of the 16th century. If Vienna had fallen in 1529, the conquest would have represented a decisive breakthrough into Central Europe, and it might have fundamentally altered the balance of power between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire. With Vienna as a base, Ottoman forces could have been positioned to threaten the rest of the Habsburg lands, to threaten Bavaria, to threaten the territories of the German princes. A successful conquest of Vienna in 1529 might have led to a cascade of further Ottoman victories, as the psychological shock of the fall of such a great Christian city would have demoralized Christian opposition and encouraged other territories to consider making peace with or submitting to Ottoman rule rather than continuing hopeless resistance. It is possible that if Vienna had fallen in 1529, the religious landscape of Europe might have been transformed. The Ottoman Empire was itself experiencing religious changes during this period, as the influence of militant Islam grew stronger and the political control of the central authority sometimes weakened in favor of more rigidly Islamic interpretations of religious law. A Europe that had fallen more completely under Ottoman domination might not have experienced the Renaissance and Reformation in the way that it did for the Ottoman Empire. While not intolerant of other religions, certainly favored Islam and may have sought to slowly transform its European territories in a more Islamic direction over the course of centuries. The cultural, religious, and political trajectory of Europe would have been profoundly different. But Vienna did not fall in 1529, and history took a different path. The successful defense of Vienna in 1529 set the stage for the long frontier warfare that would characterize the next century and a half of Ottoman-Habsburg relations, the Cold War of raids and limited campaigns that gradually wore down both empires, but left the fundamental boundary between Christian and Ottoman territories relatively stable. This stability was crucial for European development, for it allowed the Renaissance to continue to flourish, allowed the Reformation to spread and eventually to be accommodated within a new European religious configuration, allowed the nation-states of Europe to develop and strengthen even as they remained preoccupied with the Ottoman threat in the east and south. The Siege of 1683 came at a different moment in European history, when the balance of power was beginning to shift more decisively away from the Ottoman Empire. By 1683, the Ottoman Empire, while still formidable, was no longer the rising power that it had been under Suleiman the Magnificent. The European states, particularly the great powers like France, Austria, England, and the Netherlands, had grown stronger and more organized, developing more sophisticated military systems, more effective administrative structures, and more complex international relationships. The relief of Vienna in 1683 represented not the beginning of European ascendance, but rather a crucial moment in a longer process of gradual European expansion and Ottoman contraction that would continue throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The failure of the Second Siege of Vienna had immediate and significant consequences for the Ottoman Empire. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier who had led the campaign, fell from favor in the aftermath of the failure. He was eventually executed, his failure at Vienna having cost him the protection and favor that had sustained his power in Istanbul. But beyond the fall of one man, the failure of the campaign shook the Ottoman political establishment and led to a period of internal turbulence as different factions within the imperial government fought over the direction the empire should take. Some faction wanted to continue aggressive military campaigns to recover Ottoman prestige, while others advocated for consolidation, defense, and a more cautious approach to foreign policy. In the years following 1683, the balance of power in Central Europe shifted decisively against the Ottoman Empire. A series of wars, beginning almost immediately after the relief of Vienna, saw Christian forces gradually pushing back Ottoman control in Hungary and the Balkans. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formally acknowledged this shift in power, requiring the Ottoman Empire to cede Hungary to the Habsburgs, to surrender territories in the Balkans to Venice and Russia, and to acknowledge the independence of Poland, Transylvania, and Moldavia. These territorial losses were enormous, representing a reduction of Ottoman power in Europe that was unprecedented since the empire had begun its expansion 3 centuries earlier. The contrast between the outcomes of 1529 and 1683 is striking and instructive. In 1529, when the Ottomans were at the height of their power and European resistance was still being organized, Vienna was saved by the combination of determined defense and Ottoman logistical problems. In 1683, when the Ottoman Empire had already begun to decline and European powers had developed more effective military and political systems, Vienna was saved by more decisive military intervention from Allied powers and the catastrophic failure of the Ottoman assault. In both cases, however, Vienna itself remained a symbol of Christian resistance, and the success of its defense in both instances became central to the way that these events were remembered and interpreted in European historical consciousness. Let us think about what it meant to the citizens of Vienna to witness these events. In 1529, the people of Vienna experienced the terror of being surrounded by an overwhelming enemy force, the despair of facing siege with what seemed like insufficient resources, and finally, the incredible relief of seeing the enemy withdraw. That experience must have had profound psychological effects on the city and its people, reinforcing the sense that Vienna was a special place, a place where Christian Europe made its stand, a place where the survival of their civilization might depend on the strength of its walls and the courage of its defenders. Vienna became a sacred site in the consciousness of Catholic Europe, a symbol of the triumph of Christian civilization over threatening otherness. In 1683, the people of Vienna experienced many of the same emotions: terror, despair, but also, ultimately, relief and triumph. But for Vienna's residents in 1683, the siege had an additional dimension. It came after more than a century of relative security, of an assumption that perhaps the Ottoman threat had receded into history, that Vienna had become just another great European capital and need not fear the fate that had threatened it in earlier centuries. The return of the Ottoman army was shocking, a reminder that the old danger had not truly disappeared but had merely been dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The relief of Vienna in 1683 thus became even more psychologically significant than the relief of 1529 might have been, for it represented a reversal of expectations and a dramatic reminder of the continuing fragility of European security in the face of Ottoman power. The way that these sieges were remembered and interpreted had profound effects on European consciousness and on the way that Europeans understood their relationship with the Ottoman Empire and more broadly with the Islamic world. In the decades and centuries following 1683, Vienna's successful defense became a central element of the European narrative of Christian triumph over Muslim threat, of Western civilization's victory over Oriental despotism. This narrative became deeply embedded in European historical consciousness and had effects that extended far beyond the Ottoman Empire itself, influencing the way that Europeans understood colonialism, international relations, and the place of Europe within the world. But perhaps there is another way to think about these sieges, one that is less celebratory and more reflective about the costs and tragedies that were involved. When we think about Vienna in 1529 and 1683, we should remember that these were not abstract historical events, but moments of intense suffering for the people who lived through them. Soldiers died, wounded men suffered in agony, civilians were displaced from their homes, and lives were disrupted and transformed by the chaos of siege warfare. The Ottoman soldiers who laid siege to Vienna were not faceless enemies or representations of some abstract threat, but individual men who were far from home, suffering in an unfamiliar climate, enduring hunger and disease, and the constant terror of death in battle. Similarly, when we think about the broader conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe, we should remember that this was not a simple battle between good and evil, between civilization and barbarism, between the forces of progress and the forces of reaction, as some European histories portrayed it. Both the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe were complex civilizations with sophisticated cultures, with achievements and failures, with virtues and vices. The conflict between them was real and had profound consequences, but it was also more nuanced and complex than the simple narratives of triumph and defeat that sometimes emerged from European historical accounts. The Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries was not a backwards or stagnant civilization, despite what some later European historians claimed. Ottoman architecture, literature, mathematics, and military science were sophisticated and advanced by the standards of the time. Ottoman administration, while certainly flawed and sometimes corrupt, was more effectively organized across the vast distances it covered than many European governments of the same period. The Ottomans were not inherently opposed to cultural exchange or the adoption of useful technologies from other civilizations. but they were operating within a different historical and cultural framework than European powers, and the encounters between these different civilizations often led to misunderstanding and conflict as much as to mutual benefit. The Sieges of Vienna and the broader conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe of which they were part, thus represent a meeting point between different civilizations, different ways of organizing society and understanding the world, different religious and cultural traditions. The outcome of these encounters, the ultimate failure of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe, and the gradual contraction of Ottoman power in Europe, had profound consequences for the subsequent development of both the Ottoman world and Europe. But the outcome was not inevitable, and we should be cautious about assuming that European triumph was written into the fabric of history, or that Ottoman failure was the natural result of inherent cultural or civilizational deficiencies. As we consider these sieges from our vantage point in the early 21st century, we might also reflect on what they tell us about the nature of power, the role of chance in history, and the ways that individual decisions and actions can have consequences that ripple across centuries. Count Salm's determination to defend Vienna in 1529 affected the subsequent course of European history. Kara Mustafa Pasha's decision to conduct a methodical siege rather than an immediate assault in 1683 affected the outcome of that campaign and had consequences for the subsequent development of Ottoman policy. The decision of King John Sobieski to commit Polish forces to the relief of Vienna changed the military balance at a crucial moment and led to the complete reversal of the Ottoman assault. These individual decisions, made by people who could not have fully understood their consequences, had effects that transformed the history of entire regions and civilizations. History is often taught as though it is a story with an inevitable trajectory, a narrative arc that leads from past to present in a logical and predetermined way. But if we examine history carefully, particularly at moments of crisis like the Sieges of Vienna, we can see that history is actually contingent, shaped by choices and chances, by accidents and decisions that might have been different, by the actions of individuals and the push and pull of competing forces and interests. The world of 1700 could have been very different from the world that actually emerged, and the Sieges of Vienna were crucial moments in the process that led to the particular world in which we now live. The Ottoman Empire did not disappear after the relief of Vienna in 1683, nor did it immediately cease to be a major power in Europe. Instead, it entered into a long, slow process of contraction and decline that would last until its final dissolution in 1922, almost 2.5 centuries later. This long decline was not a smooth, inevitable process, but rather a series of stops and starts, of moments of revival and renewed vigor interspersed with periods of stagnation and loss. But the fundamental trajectory was clear. The Ottoman Empire would not again dominate the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans as it had in the 16th and early 17th centuries, nor would it again threaten to transform the political balance of Europe through military conquest. The Habsburg Empire, meanwhile, would continue to expand its influence in Central Europe throughout the 18th century, though it would also face numerous challenges and threats from other European powers. The Habsburgs' role as defenders of Christendom against the Ottoman threat would gradually give way to their role as one power among several in the European great power system, competing with France, Russia, Prussia, and others for influence and territory. Vienna itself would continue to grow and develop, becoming one of the great capitals of Europe, a center of culture and learning, a place where the Enlightenment and later movements in European thought would flourish. The religious significance of the sieges of Vienna, particularly the Second Siege, should not be overlooked. For the Catholic Church and for Catholic Europe, the relief of Vienna in 1683 was interpreted as a divine intervention, a sign that God had chosen to preserve Christian Europe and to protect it from Islamic conquest. The Pope celebrated the victory with religious services, and the relief of Vienna became a central part of Catholic triumphalism and the narrative of Christian victory over Islamic threat. This religious interpretation of the events had profound effects on the way that subsequent conflicts between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire were understood and justified. From the perspective of the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic world, these same events could be interpreted very differently. The failure of the Second Siege of Vienna could be seen as a test of faith, a trial sent by God to test the resolve of the Islamic community, or alternatively, as a turning point where the Islamic world had to confront the reality that the expansionist phase of Ottoman power had come to an end, and that the empire would henceforth be on the defensive. The subsequent contraction of Ottoman power in Europe and the gradual encroachment of Christian powers on Ottoman territories became a source of pain and concern within the Islamic world, part of the broader narrative of European dominance and Islamic weakness that would become increasingly prominent in the 19th and 20th centuries. The legacy of the sieges of Vienna extends beyond the immediate political and military consequences and into the realm of culture, art, and memory. In the centuries following 1683, the relief of Vienna became a subject of artistic celebration and commemoration. Paintings depicted the crucial moments of the siege and the relief, with King John Sobieski riding triumphantly into Vienna, becoming one of the great iconic images of European history. The siege and relief were commemorated in music, in literature, and in the visual arts, becoming part of the cultural heritage of Europe and particularly of the Catholic and Austro-Hungarian tradition. Vienna itself became a monument to its own triumph, with buildings constructed to celebrate its survival and its role as defender of Christian Europe. In the Ottoman world, meanwhile, the memory of the failed siege of 1683 eventually faded into history, becoming one episode among many in the long history of Ottoman military campaigns. But the failure was significant, for it marked the end of Ottoman expansionism in Europe and the beginning of the long contraction that would characterize Ottoman history in subsequent centuries. Ottoman historians and intellectuals would eventually grapple with the question of why Ottoman power had waned, why the empire that had once seemed destined to dominate Europe had instead been gradually pushed back. Some blamed internal decay and corruption. Others blamed the rise of more organized and powerful European states. Still others blamed fortune or the will of God. The answers to these questions would profoundly shape Ottoman and subsequently Turkish understanding of their place in world history. The Sieges of Vienna also became important in the development of military science and military history. Both sieges were studied by military theorists and strategists, examined for the lessons they contained about fortification design, about logistics and supply, about the dynamics of siege warfare, about the importance of morale and leadership. The successful defense of Vienna became a model for other cities and regions seeking to resist Ottoman or other military pressure. The techniques that Starhemberg and Salm had used to defend Vienna, the careful management of resources, the psychological management of morale, the preparation of contingency defenses, the coordination of relief forces became part of the toolkit of military commanders throughout Europe. Let us now turn our thoughts toward the broader patterns that these sieges reveal about the nature of historical development. The sieges of Vienna, separated by more than a century and a half, show us how civilizations and empires develop and change over time, how power shifts from one group to another, how the fortunes of great cities and peoples are intimately connected to large-scale historical processes that are sometimes difficult to fully understand or predict. The Ottoman Empire in 1529 was at the height of its power, confident in its military superiority, willing to risk vast resources on ambitious military campaigns. The Ottoman Empire in 1683 was beginning to decline, still formidable but no longer as uniformly excellent in its military capabilities, still ambitious but lacking the resources or the administrative efficiency to carry through its ambitions. This decline was not inevitable or predetermined, but it was the result of complex historical processes, changes in technology, shifts in the distribution of power among European states, internal problems within the Ottoman administration, the emergence of new rivals in other parts of the world. Similarly, the Christian powers of Europe in 1529 were fragmented and often in conflict with each other, weakened by religious divisions and political rivalries, but they were capable of defending themselves and of eventually regaining territories lost to the Ottomans. The Christian powers of Europe in 1683 were similarly fragmented and often in conflict, but they were more organized, more militarily advanced, more capable of coordinating their efforts through diplomatic channels and military alliances. The relief of Vienna in 1683 involved the coordination of Habsburg, Polish, Saxon, and other forces, a level of international military coordination that would have been difficult to achieve in earlier centuries. The rise and fall of empires, the shift in the balance of power between civilizations, the emergence of new powers, and the decline of old ones, these are some of the grand themes of history, and the Sieges of Vienna provide vivid illustrations of these themes. But we should be careful not to interpret these historical developments as part of some grand narrative of inevitable progress, or as confirmation of the superiority of one civilization over another. The fact that Christian Europe ultimately prevailed over Ottoman expansion does not mean that European civilization was inherently superior to Ottoman or Islamic civilization, nor does it mean that this outcome was inevitable or written into the fabric of history. It means rather that at particular moments in time, for particular reasons, the balance of power shifted in ways that favored the Christian powers and that led to the ultimate contraction of Ottoman power in Europe. We might also reflect on the role of individuals and personal decisions in shaping these historical outcomes. What if Count Salm had been a less capable defender in 1529? What if the Ottoman supply lines had been more efficient? What if the rains had not come that autumn, leaving the ground passable for Ottoman supply wagons? What if Suleiman had been willing to continue the siege into the winter despite the hardships involved? Conversely, in 1683, what if Kara Mustafa had launched an immediate all-out assault instead of conducting a methodical siege? What if King John Sobieski had decided that Polish interests were better served by remaining out of the conflict and allowing Vienna to fall? What if the relief cavalry had arrived a few hours later, after the final Ottoman assault had already breached Vienna's walls? These are not idle speculations, but reflections on the contingency of history, on the role of chance and individual decision-making in shaping events that had profound consequences for millions of people across centuries. As we approach the end of our long night of reflection on these historical events, we might ask ourselves what the Sieges of Vienna have to teach us about the present world and about human nature itself. One lesson might be about the importance of preparation and planning. Both Count Salm and Ernst von Starhemberg succeeded in defending Vienna not because they were blessed with superior numbers, they were vastly outnumbered in both cases, but because they prepared carefully, because they thought through the challenges they would face, because they created systems and structures that could withstand the pressures they knew would come. This is a lesson that applies not just to military defense, but to many areas of human endeavor. Another lesson might be about the importance of courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The defenders of Vienna in both sieges were not superhuman heroes, but ordinary soldiers and citizens who chose to stand and fight even when the situation seemed hopeless. The psychological strength that allowed them to resist despair, to continue fighting even when every rational calculation suggested that they should surrender, was crucial to their success. There is something in the human spirit that can rise to meet extraordinary challenges, and the sieges of Vienna provide us with illustrations of that capacity. Yet another lesson might be about the limits of military power and the unpredictability of human affairs. The Ottoman Empire, with all its military might and organizational skill, could not guarantee victory at Vienna because of factors beyond their control supply lines that could not be reliably maintained, weather that disrupted their operations, the resolve of defenders who refused to be broken, the emergence of relief forces that changed the military balance at crucial moments. We might reflect on how, in our own world, military power, wealth, and technological superiority do not always guarantee victory or even survival, and how circumstances and chance continue to play crucial roles in determining outcomes. The sieges of Vienna also teach us about the importance of cultural memory and historical consciousness. The way that these events were remembered and interpreted had profound effects on the way that Europeans and Ottomans understood themselves and each other in subsequent centuries. The triumph of Vienna became central to European identity and to the narrative of Christian civilization's defense against otherness. This memory shaped diplomatic relations, influenced religious attitudes, affected the way that Europeans approached colonialism and international relations. The meaning of historical events is not fixed in time, but is continually reinterpreted and reimagined by subsequent generations. And this process of reinterpretation can have just as much historical significance as the original events themselves. As we now move toward the conclusion of our long meditation on these historical events, let us take a moment to consider Vienna itself, the city that stands at the center of our story. Vienna in 1529 was a frontier fortress, a place of tension and vigilance, a city that knew itself to be in danger. Vienna in 1683 was a great capital, wealthy and cultured, but suddenly reminded of the danger that lurked to the east. Vienna in the modern world is a city of extraordinary beauty and culture, a center of art and music and intellectual life, a living monument to the history that created it. To walk through Vienna today is to walk through layers of history, through the remains of medieval walls and Renaissance buildings and Baroque palaces, each one a reminder of the events and people that created this city and shaped its destiny. The walls of Vienna that successfully resisted the Ottoman sieges are still standing in parts of the city, preserved and maintained as historical monuments and reminders of the city's past. The fortifications that were designed and rebuilt over centuries are now largely gone or transformed into parks and public spaces, but their memory lingers in the geography and layout of the city itself. The places where the Ottoman armies camped are now neighborhoods and suburbs, where modern Viennese live their daily lives, often unaware of the historical significance of the ground beneath their feet. This is how the past becomes present, how historical events become woven into the fabric of contemporary life, so thoroughly integrated into the landscape and the consciousness of a place that we sometimes forget they are there. Think now about the experience of standing in Vienna and knowing its history, knowing that on this ground, more than 4 centuries ago, armies had gathered, that in the streets and on the walls, men had fought and died, that the entire future of the continent had hung in the balance. There is something deeply moving about this knowledge, something that connects us to the past and reminds us of our continuity with people who lived centuries before us, who made decisions and took actions that affected not just their own lives, but the lives of people they would never know, living in centuries they would never see. The Siege of Vienna ultimately teaches us that history is not merely a series of dates and facts to be memorized, nor is it merely a record of great deeds and famous people. History is a living thing, something that connects us to the past and shapes our present, something that we continue to create and recreate through the way that we remember and interpret events. When we study the Sieges of Vienna, we are not merely learning about events that happened 4 centuries ago, but we are engaging with fundamental questions about human nature, about the nature of power and civilization, about the ways that chance and decision shape the course of events, about the legacy that we inherit from the past and that we will pass on to the future. As our long night of contemplation draws to a close, let us return one more time to the moment of the relief of Vienna in 1683, to that crucial instant when King John Sobieski and his cavalry appeared on the heights overlooking the city, when the outcome that had seemed inevitable just hours before suddenly transformed into its opposite. In that moment, we see all the themes that we have been exploring come together: the courage of the defenders, the arrival of help from an unexpected quarter, the role of chance and timing in determining outcomes, the profound significance of events that we can scarcely predict or control. In that moment, we also see something about the nature of human community and solidarity, the way that people separated by distance and difference can come together to defend common interests, the way that civilization and culture can motivate people to sacrifice their comfort and even their lives. The Ottoman soldiers who retreated from Vienna in September 1683 did not know, as they fled before the Polish cavalry charge, that they were witnessing a turning point in the history of their empire, that they were part of a moment that would eventually lead to the transformation of Ottoman power and the reshaping of the political order of Europe. They knew only the immediate experience, the shock of the cavalry charge, the chaos and confusion of retreat, the fear and disorientation of soldiers far from home being driven back from the prize they had sought. In the same way, the defenders of Vienna in 1683 could not have fully understood, in the moments when relief finally came, that they were participating in an event that would be celebrated for centuries to come, that they were part of a turning point in European history. They knew only the immediate experience, the overwhelming relief, the joy of unexpected salvation, the pride of having held their ground against overwhelming odds. This is one of the profound lessons that history teaches us, that we live always in a kind of twilight where the ultimate significance and consequences of our actions are hidden from us, where we cannot fully see or understand how the choices we make and the things we do will echo through time and affect people we will never know. The defenders of Vienna, whether in 1529 or 1683, made their stands, not knowing how those stands would be remembered and interpreted in subsequent centuries, not knowing what larger historical forces their actions would serve, not knowing whether their sacrifice would ultimately matter or would be forgotten. Yet we know now, across the centuries, that what they did mattered profoundly, that their choices affected not just their own lives, but the lives of millions of people living in centuries they could never have imagined. As we prepare to close this long meditation on Vienna and its sieges, we might find ourselves thinking about connections between the past and the present, about the ways that history continues to echo through our world, about the responsibility we carry as inheritors of the past to remember and to honor those who came before us. The Sieges of Vienna are not merely historical events belonging to a distant past, but they are part of our inheritance, part of the story of how the world we live in came to be as it is. To understand Vienna and its sieges is to understand something about ourselves and about the forces that have shaped our world. The Ottoman Empire that unsuccessfully besieged Vienna is long gone now, dissolved more than a century ago, its territories divided among other powers, its memories and legacies transformed and reinterpreted by the successor states that emerged from its dissolution. The Habsburg Empire that defended Vienna also eventually dissolved, transformed by the great upheavals of the 20th century into the modern nation-state of Austria, which continues to be a significant player in European affairs. Vienna itself has continued to grow and develop, recovering from devastation in the 20th century to become once again one of the great cultural and political centers of Europe, is less than #0. 5 is greater than. The walls that were built to defend Vienna against the Ottoman armies are no longer necessary for defense in a modern world where warfare has been transformed by technology and ideology, but they remain as monuments to a past age, reminders of the eternal struggle between civilizations and the capacity of human beings to both destroy and create, to wage war and to build beautiful cities. As we finally come to the end of our long night of storytelling and reflection, let us settle into a kind of peace with these historical events, accepting that they belong to the past and cannot be changed, but that they remain relevant to us and continue to speak to us across the centuries that separate us from them. Let us honor the courage of those who defended Vienna, both in 1529 and in 1683, not because they were perfect or because we must agree with all their beliefs and values, but because they faced extraordinary circumstances with determination and courage, and because their actions had consequences that extended far beyond their own lives and times. Let us also perhaps develop a kind of compassion for those on the other side, the Ottoman soldiers and commanders who fought for their empire and their beliefs, who suffered and died in unfamiliar lands, who were separated from their homes and families, who were ultimately defeated not by superior virtue, but by circumstance and the luck of historical timing. In the end, the Sieges of Vienna teach us that history is complex and multifaceted, that events that seem clear and simple when viewed from a distance become more nuanced and complicated the more closely we examine them, that the triumph of one civilization or power over another is never absolute or uncomplicated, that the past lives on in the present in ways that we often do not recognize, that the actions of individuals can have consequences that ripple through time in ways we cannot predict or fully understand. These are the lessons that history has to teach us, and they are lessons that remain relevant in every age, that speak to us across the centuries with a voice that is both distant and intimately familiar. As you drift towards sleep now, cradled in the safety of the present moment, freed from the duties and concerns that occupy your waking hours, you might carry with you these images and reflections from the Sieges of Vienna. Picture the walls of Vienna standing against the Ottoman artillery, the defenders keeping their vigil despite overwhelming odds, the moment of relief when the enemy finally withdraws or when rescue arrives from an unexpected quarter. Think about the courage it takes to face danger and uncertainty, the importance of preparation and planning, the role of chance in determining outcomes, the ways that individual decisions can affect millions of people across centuries. And as these thoughts drift through your mind, let them carry you gently toward sleep, toward rest, toward dreams that might explore further the themes and ideas that we have explored together this long night. Vienna stands still, even now, in our modern world, a city of beauty and culture and history, a place where the echoes of the past can still be heard for those who listen carefully. The sieges that threatened it belong to the past. The armies have long since turned to dust. The soldiers and defenders and commanders are all gone, their names remembered by historians, and their sacrifices honored in monuments and commemorations. Yet the meaning of what happened at Vienna, the lessons that these events teach us, remain eternally present, remain relevant to every human being who contemplates them, remain as pertinent to our lives today as they were to the lives of the people who lived through them centuries ago. Sleep well, knowing that you have journeyed through time with us, that you have contemplated great events and profound questions, that you have connected yourself through knowledge and imagination to the people of the past, who struggled and fought and endured so that history could continue forward into the present moment where you now rest. The world we inhabit, with all its complexity and diversity, with all its problems and possibilities, is shaped by the past in ways both obvious and subtle, and understanding that past, understanding Vienna and its sieges, understanding the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg dynasty, understanding the long history of struggle and conflict and adaptation and change is a way of understanding ourselves and our world more fully and completely. And so our long meditation on the sieges of Vienna comes to an end, but the story itself, the larger historical narrative in which these events are embedded, continues on, continues to unfold in the present moment, and will continue into the future. Each generation reinterprets these events in light of its own concerns and questions, finding new meaning and relevance in the past. We invite you to think about what these sieges mean to you, what lessons you draw from them, what questions they raise about human nature and civilization and the course of history. And we wish you the most restful and peaceful of sleep, knowing that you have given yourself the gift of contemplation and reflection, the gift of connecting with the past and finding meaning in history. May your dreams be peaceful and your rest be deep.